They were not supposed to be there. Templar riders, crossing a moonlit desert, far from the courts of Europe, far from the cheers of crusading sermons, moving through a land older than the faith they had sworn to defend. And according to later legend, they were not searching for gold, not conquest, not even relics. They were searching for a lineage, a sacred inheritance whispered to reach back beyond Christianity, beyond Jerusalem, into the royal blood of Egypt itself, to Horus, the falcon god of kings. But did the Templars discover this hidden tradition? Did they inherit it? Or did later centuries create the map after the riders were already gone? To follow this story, we have to slow down, because the most dangerous legends are rarely pure invention. They grow around places that were real, men who truly lived, and silences that history never quite managed to explain. So tonight, we begin not with an answer, but with an image. Armed monks beneath a cold desert sky, carrying crosses on their cloaks while moving through landscapes once ruled by pharaohs, prophets, hermits, merchants, and conquerors. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The mystery before us is not whether the Knights Templar became guardians of an ancient Egyptian bloodline in any simple, provable sense. The evidence for that is thin, and much of it belongs to later imagination. The deeper question is more interesting. Why would people come to believe it? Why would an order born from crusade and pilgrimage become linked, centuries later, to Egypt, initiation, divine kingship, and the blood of Horus? Somewhere between history and myth, a strange map appears, one that should not exist, yet refuses to disappear. Chapter 2. Beneath the Cross, an older shadow. The Knights Templar began, at least on the surface, with a practical problem. After the First Crusade, Jerusalem was in Christian hands, but holding a holy city was not the same as making it safe. Pilgrims came from Europe with faith in their hearts and very little understanding of the roads. They crossed seas, ports, mountains, and dry inland tracts, believing that arrival in the Holy Land would bring them closer to salvation. Instead, many found danger waiting in the spaces between towns. This is where the Templars first step into history, not as sorcerers, not as guardians of an Egyptian secret, but as a small brotherhood of knights sworn to protect pilgrims. That plain beginning matters, because legends often become most powerful when they are attached to institutions that were real. A completely imaginary order can be dismissed. But the Templars existed. They had charters, property, patrons, enemies, rules, and influence. They were monks with swords, warriors bound by vows, a contradiction so striking that even without later myths, they would have seemed unusual. They lived under the sign of the cross. They prayed like monks. They fought like nobles. And they occupied a position in medieval imagination that was already unstable. Holy men who shed blood, poor knights who became wealthy, servants of Christ who answered to powers beyond ordinary local control. From the beginning, they were easy to misunderstand. Or perhaps more accurately, they were easy to reimagine. The order emerged in the world created by crusade, where geography itself had become theological. Jerusalem was not merely a city, it was memory made visible. Every hill and gate seemed to carry a passage from Scripture, A road was not just a road if prophets, kings, apostles, and conquerors had walked it before. In that landscape, the past did not feel dead. It felt layered, and the Templars were placed directly on one of the most charged layers of all. Their early headquarters were associated with the Temple Mount, a site already heavy with Jewish, Christian, and Islamic meaning. To medieval Europeans, the word temple could summon Solomon, sacrifice, prophecy, lost wisdom, and divine architecture. It was not difficult for later writers to imagine that men living so close to such a place might have found something hidden beneath it. A relic, a document, a teaching, a genealogy, a truth too dangerous for the church to name. The trouble is that imagination often moves faster than evidence. What we can say with more confidence is that the Templars became powerful because they served a real need. They protected roots, received donations, built networks across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, and developed a system that allowed money, land, and military resources to move with unusual efficiency. Their mystery, in their own time, may have been less occult than administrative. They knew how to organize. That does not sound as thrilling as a buried Egyptian bloodline, but it may be one reason the later legends found such good soil. Power attracts stories. Secrecy attracts darker ones. And the Templars had both. Their rituals were not public in the modern sense. Their internal discipline was strict. Their initiation ceremonies were closed to outsiders, as were those of many religious orders. To a suspicious mind, privacy can look like concealment. To a hostile ruler, concealment can be made to look like guilt. And to later storytellers, guilt can be transformed into hidden knowledge. This is the first important turn in our investigation. The link between the Templars and Egypt is not something that stands clearly in the records of the early order. It grows later from suggestion, symbolism, and retrospective interpretation. The Knights were in the east. Egypt was near. Crusaders fought in and around Egyptian territory. The desert between Egypt and Jerusalem was crossed by armies, monks, traders, and pilgrims. Ideas could travel there, and sometimes did. But contact is not the same as inheritance. To say the Templars moved through a world touched by Egyptian antiquity is reasonable. To say they preserved the bloodline of Horus is something else entirely. Still, legends do not require proof to survive. They require shape. They require a pattern people can feel, even when they cannot demonstrate it. And the Templar pattern was unusually seductive, a sacred military order stationed near the ruins of biblical kingship, rising to wealth and influence, then destroyed under accusations of secret practices. Once that pattern existed, older shadows could be placed beneath the cross. Egypt became one of those shadows. For medieval Christians, Egypt was already complicated. It was the land of exodus and bondage, but also of refuge. It was where the Holy Family fled, according to Christian tradition. It was the home of desert monasticism, where early Christian ascetics withdrew from empire to wrestle with demons, hunger, and themselves. It was also the land of ancient temples, hieroglyphs, and kings whose monuments seemed to belong to a world almost impossibly old. Later ages would turn that Egypt into a symbol of hidden wisdom. The Templars, because they stood at the meeting point of crusade, temple, secrecy, and downfall, were gradually pulled into that symbolic Egypt. Not necessarily because they had carried its secrets, but because they looked like the kind of men who might have done so. And that distinction is crucial. A legend can reveal very little about what happened, while revealing a great deal about what people wanted history to contain. In the Templar myth, the cross is never just a cross. It becomes a surface. Beneath it, later imagination places older signs: the falcon, the serpent, the sacred king, the desert initiation, the hidden name. The medieval order becomes a vessel into which much older dreams of authority are poured. That is why the story cannot be dismissed too quickly, even when its factual claims are weak. Not because it proves a secret Egyptian bloodline, but because it shows how sacred power is remembered. Every age inherits ruins from the one before it. Some ruins are made of stone, others are made of symbols. The Templars walked through both, and when they vanished, they left behind enough silence for later centuries to hear almost anything inside it. Chapter 3: Horus and the Divine Line of Kings. Long before the Templars rode east, long before Jerusalem became the center of Crusader ambition, another idea of sacred power had taken shape along the Nile. It did not begin with knights. It did not begin with churches. It began with kingship imagined as something more than politics. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not simply a ruler who happened to be favored by the gods. He was woven into the divine order itself. To understand why later legends might reach toward Horus, we have to step away from the medieval world for a moment and enter a far older one, where authority was not separated into neat categories of religion, state, blood, ritual, and cosmic balance. These things belonged together. Horus was central to that vision. He was often imagined as a falcon, or as a falcon-headed god, a figure of sky, kingship, protection, and rightful rule. In myth, Horus was the son of Osiris and Isis, the divine child who survives violence, contests disorder, and becomes associated with legitimate sovereignty. His story was not merely a tale told about gods in some distant heavenly realm. It provided a language through which kingship itself could be understood. The living pharaoh could be identified with Horus. That does not mean every king was believed to be Horus in a simple, cartoonish way, as though a god were wearing a crown and pretending to be human. Ancient religious thought was often subtler than modern summaries allow. The pharaoh embodied a role. He carried a divine office. He stood at the point where human rule and cosmic order met. This is where the idea of a bloodline of Horus becomes both fascinating and dangerous. Fascinating, because Egyptian kingship did care deeply about descent, legitimacy, inheritance, and sacred continuity. Dangerous, because later storytellers can easily turn a complex religious political idea into something much cruder, a secret biological chain, preserved without interruption, waiting to be rediscovered by medieval knights. The evidence does not give us that. What it gives us is stranger in a quieter way. In Egypt, blood mattered, but blood alone was not enough. A king's legitimacy had to be performed, recognized, ritualized, and set within the larger order called Mayat, the principle of balance, justice, truth, and right arrangement. The pharaoh's task was not only to command people, collect taxes, build monuments, or lead armies. His sacred duty was to maintain the world as it was meant to be. The Nile must flood, the temples must be served, the gods must be honored, the borders must be protected, chaos must be pushed back. A king who failed in these things did not simply make bad policy. He threatened the pattern of creation. That is the great difference between modern ideas of power and ancient sacred kingship. Today, We may speak of legitimacy through elections, laws, constitutions, blood descent, revolution, or consent. In ancient Egypt, legitimacy had a cosmic dimension. The right ruler did not merely occupy a throne. He helped keep the universe from slipping into disorder. Horus gave this office an image. The falcon sees from above. The king watches over the land. The god defeats the forces that threaten order. The pharaoh becomes the earthly bearer of that victory, generation after generation. When one king dies, another takes the Horus name. The office survives the body. That detail matters. Because if we are searching for a line, the most historically grounded line is not necessarily a hidden family tree. It is a line of office, symbolism, ritual identity, and sacred authority. The king dies, but Horus continues. The body changes, but the crown remains charged with divine meaning. This is probably closer to how ancient Egyptians thought about kingship than any modern fantasy of a single secret blood strain. The pharaoh was also linked to Osiris after death. In simplified terms, the living king was associated with Horus, while the dead king entered the world of Osiris. This pattern created a powerful cycle: death, succession, renewal, legitimacy. The new ruler did not simply replace the old one. He restored order by stepping into a sacred drama that had been rehearsed since mythic time. To us, that may sound symbolic. To ancient Egypt, symbolism was not decoration. It was a way of making reality hold together. A crown, a name, a temple wall, a procession, a carved falcon above a royal title. These were not just artistic choices, they were acts of meaning. They told the world who had the right to rule, why that right mattered, and how fragile order could be if the chain broke. This is one reason Horus became such a useful figure for later imagination. He offered a model of sacred monarchy older than Christianity and older than medieval Europe. He represented a kind of authority that did not need a pope, a bishop, or a feudal contract to explain itself. It came from the deep grammar of divine kingship, the ruler as heir, protector, embodiment, and vessel. Centuries later, when European writers and occult thinkers began searching for ancient sources of hidden wisdom, Egypt was almost irresistible. Its monuments outlived the languages of those who built them. Its gods had animal forms, celestial associations, and ritual complexity. Its kings ruled beneath titles that seemed half human and half divine. To minds hungry for secret continuity, Egypt looked less like a civilization and more like a locked archive. Horus stood near the entrance to that archive. But if we are careful, we should notice something. The ancient Egyptian idea of sacred kingship does not need the Templars to be meaningful. It was already profound on its own terms. The later attempt to connect it to medieval knights may reveal less about Egypt than about the desires of later ages. The desire to find one hidden thread behind every throne, every temple, every forbidden teaching. The real Egyptian tradition was not a simple secret waiting to be smuggled into Europe. It was an entire worldview. In that worldview, kingship was not merely inherited. It was renewed. It was enacted through ritual, confirmed by divine association, and measured by the ruler's ability to sustain order against chaos. A weak king, a contested succession, a foreign invasion, or a neglected temple could all be understood as more than political trouble. They were cracks in the cosmic surface. And here, quietly, the Templar legend finds one of its strongest symbolic echoes. The Templars, too, would later be imagined as guardians of order at a sacred threshold. They were not kings, but they lived near the idea of the temple. They served a holy geography. They bound violence to religious discipline. They stood between pilgrims and danger, between Europe and the East, between public devotion and private ritual. None of this proves they inherited anything from Horus, but it helps explain why the comparison seduces the imagination. Both traditions circle around a similar question. Where does sacred authority come from? From blood? From divine favor? From ritual office? From guardianship of holy places? From a story people agree to believe because it makes power feel ancient, lawful, and inevitable? The Egyptian answer was not identical to the medieval Christian one, but both understood something modern people sometimes forget. Power is rarely satisfied with force alone. It wants a genealogy. It wants a myth of origin. It wants to say, I do not merely rule because I can. I rule because I continue something older than myself. That is the heart of the Horus line, not a trail of hidden descendants moving invisibly through history, at least not in any form we can prove, but a sacred idea of kingship that could outlive dynasties, survive translation, and reappear in unexpected places whenever people began asking who had the right to command and why. By the time later legends placed that idea in the hands of the Templars, the ancient falcon had already flown far from the Nile, not as a fact preserved in parchment perhaps, but as a symbol, sharpened by distance, darkened by mystery, and ready to be mistaken for a secret. Chapter 4. The Desert Between Egypt and Jerusalem. Between Egypt and Jerusalem, there is a landscape that has always done more than separate places. It filters them. The desert does not simply lie between one civilization and another like an empty margin on a map. It changes whatever passes through it. Armies become slower there. Pilgrims become more aware of thirst, distance, and danger. Merchants learn which routes can be trusted, which wells are remembered, which guides are worth their price. Monks go into it to escape the noise of the world, only to discover that the noise has followed them inward. For anyone trying to understand how Egypt and the Holy Land became connected in religious imagination, the desert is not background. It is one of the main characters. Look at the region too quickly, and it becomes a simple triangle of names. Egypt, Sinai, Jerusalem. But in history, those names were connected by movement. People crossed, ideas crossed, stories crossed. Some crossings were official and military, with banners, horses, supply lines, and frightened scouts. Others were quieter, a monk carrying a text, a trader repeating a rumor, a pilgrim returning home with a tale improved by exhaustion. The desert preserved nothing in the easy sense. It was not a sealed vault. It did not keep traditions unchanged, perfectly wrapped beneath the sand. That is a fantasy. What it did preserve were routes of contact, difficult, fragile, sometimes dangerous routes, through which fragments could move. This distinction matters, because later legends often treat the desert as a kind of mystical storage chamber. They imagine that ancient truths waited there untouched until someone worthy arrived. The real desert was less romantic and more interesting. It was a zone of exchange, misunderstanding, adaptation, and survival. What traveled across it rarely arrived unchanged. Egypt and the Levant had been connected long before the crusading age. Their relationship was older than Christianity, older than Islam, older than the medieval kingdoms that fought over Jerusalem. Influence moved in both directions through trade, diplomacy, war, migration, and religion. The Sinai Peninsula, in particular, sat between worlds. It could be a barrier, but it could also be a corridor. To the biblical imagination, that corridor was already charged with meaning. The desert was the place of exodus, wandering, testing, covenant, hunger, and revelation. It was where a people could be stripped of certainty and forced to depend on a God who did not always explain himself. For Christians, the desert also became the landscape of temptation and withdrawal, where Christ fasted and where later ascetics tried to imitate holy endurance. Then there was Egypt itself, not only the Egypt of Pharaoh and bondage, but also the Egypt of refuge. Christian memory held that the Holy Family fled there. Early monasticism flourished there. Desert fathers and mothers withdrew into remote places, not because they thought the desert was empty, but because they believed emptiness could reveal what crowded cities concealed. So when medieval pilgrims and crusaders entered this region, they were not stepping into a blank space. They were moving through a geography already crowded with sacred memory. Every road had too many pasts. That is what makes the later Templar connection to Egypt plausible in atmosphere, even when it remains weak in evidence. The Templars operated in a world where Egypt was not impossibly distant from Jerusalem, either geographically or symbolically. Crusader politics repeatedly drew attention toward Egypt. Military campaigns, alliances, fears, ambitions, and trade routes all made the Nile world part of the broader Eastern Mediterranean horizon. A knight in the Latin East did not need to be an occult initiate to know that Egypt mattered. It mattered strategically. It mattered economically. It mattered theologically. It mattered because empires had always known that whoever controlled the passages between Egypt and Syria could shape the fate of the region. It mattered because stories from Scripture placed Egypt at the beginning of Israel's liberation and at the edge of Christian memory. But here again, we have to be careful. The existence of contact does not prove the transmission of a secret doctrine. It only opens the possibility that stories, symbols, and impressions could travel. A pilgrim might see an ancient monument and understand almost nothing about it, yet still feel its age. A crusader might hear of Egyptian wisdom without knowing Egyptian religion. A monk might preserve a text whose meanings had shifted through translation. A merchant might carry a rumor farther than a scholar could carry an argument. History often moves like that, not as a clean inheritance, but as a chain of partial understandings. Imagine a group of armed men crossing the dry spaces south of the Holy Land. They carry Christian prayers, Latin discipline, and the assumptions of their age. Around them lies a landscape shaped by older empires, older gods, older roads. They do not need to comprehend all of it. In fact, misunderstanding may be part of how legends are born. A half-recognized symbol can be more powerful than a clearly translated one, because the mind rushes in to complete what knowledge leaves unfinished. The desert encourages that kind of thinking. Distance makes patterns feel intentional. Hardship sharpens memory. A story told after a dangerous journey does not remain a travel report for long. It becomes a sign, a warning, a revelation, a clue. This is why the desert between Egypt and Jerusalem becomes so important to the myth of the Templars and the bloodline of Horus. It provides the missing middle. Without it, Egypt and the Templars seem too far apart. Ancient pharaohs on one side, medieval crusading knights on the other. The desert gives storytellers a bridge. Not a bridge of proof, but a bridge of possibility. Across that bridge, later imagination could send almost anything. A hidden teaching, a royal genealogy, a temple secret, a memory of divine kingship, detached from the Nile and reattached to Jerusalem. The real historical bridge was more modest, but not meaningless. Monastic communities, trade networks, diplomatic contacts, crusader warfare, and pilgrimage all created spaces where cultures encountered one another. Some encounters were respectful, some were violent, some were practical and brief, some left traces. Most vanished without record. That silence is frustrating for historians, but useful for myth. Where documents are absent, speculation grows. Where roots are known, but conversations are lost, later writers can populate the road with whatever their theories require. This is how a desert path becomes a corridor of initiation, how a military campaign becomes a quest for forbidden wisdom, how geography becomes genealogy. Yet we should not throw away the mystery simply because it has been exaggerated. The desert really was a place where religious memory crossed boundaries. Jewish, Christian, Islamic, and older Near Eastern associations overlapped there. Egypt's ancient past did not disappear just because most medieval Europeans could not read hieroglyphs. Ruins still stood. Names survived. Biblical stories kept Egypt alive in the Christian imagination, and the very incompleteness of understanding gave Egypt a strange afterlife as a land of veiled knowledge. For the Templars, the desert may have been a road, a frontier, a battlefield, a hardship, or a rumor. For later legend, it became something else, the space where one sacred system might have touched another. Horus does not need to appear openly there. No falcon has to descend over a crusader camp. No hidden priest has to hand a scroll to a knight beneath the stars. Those images belong to fiction unless evidence supports them. But symbols can travel without ceremonies. Ideas can survive as echoes. Sacred kingship can be reinterpreted through new languages, new theologies, and new ambitions. The desert, then, is not proof of the bloodline. It is the reason the story feels possible. It holds Egypt close enough to Jerusalem for imagination to work. It allows the ancient and the medieval to face one another across a harsh, luminous distance. And it reminds us that history is not made only in palaces, temples, and battlefields. Sometimes it is made along the route between them, where travelers are tired, records are thin, and a story can change shape before anyone writes it down. Chapter 5. What the Templars really sought in the East. Before the Templars became a legend, they were a solution. Not a perfect solution, not a simple one, but a practical response to a dangerous world. The first image many people carry of the order is already distorted by centuries of fiction. Knights in white mantles digging beneath Jerusalem by torchlight, lifting a sealed chest from the darkness, discovering a truth that would shake the church if spoken aloud. It is a powerful image. It is also exactly the kind of image that needs to be handled carefully, because it tells us more about later fascination than about the order's first purpose. What the Templars really sought in the East was not, at least in the beginning, an Egyptian bloodline or an occult inheritance. They sought security. After Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, pilgrimage did not become safe overnight. The holy places might have been under Latin Christian control, but the roads remained vulnerable. Pilgrims were exposed, often poorly armed, and moving through unfamiliar territory. A small religious military brotherhood dedicated to guarding them made sense in that world. It was not romantic. It was necessary. That is the first correction the legend requires. The Templars were not founded as treasure hunters. They were formed as protectors. Their genius, if we can call it that, lay in the fusion of two identities that medieval society usually kept in tension. The monk renounced the world. The knight acted violently within it. The Templar attempted to become both, disciplined, obedient, prayerful, and armed. To modern eyes, that combination can seem almost impossible. To the 12th century, it was startling but comprehensible, especially in a culture where the defense of pilgrims and holy places could be framed as sacred duty. This is why their rise was so swift. The order attracted support because it stood at the center of medieval longing: salvation, warfare, pilgrimage, sacrifice, and prestige. Nobles donated land and money. Rulers granted privileges. Church approval gave them a spiritual legitimacy that ordinary mercenaries could never claim. The Templars became more than a group of escorts on dusty roads. They became an institution with estates in Europe, fortresses in the East, and a financial network that helped move resources across long distances. Again, this does not sound like the beginning of a secret Egyptian tradition, but it does explain how the order became mysterious. Scale creates distance. Distance creates rumor. A local knight is known by his neighbors. A trans-regional order is known by reputation, by fragments, by stories carried across borders. The Templars collected wealth, yet spoke the language of poverty. They served the church, yet operated with unusual independence. They fought in public, but lived behind internal rules. They were visible enough to become famous, closed enough to become suspect. And then there was the Temple Mount. The order's very name drew power from association with the ancient temple. In Jerusalem, their headquarters were linked to a site that medieval Christians identified with the Temple of Solomon. Even if the order's daily concerns were horses, discipline, supplies, patrols, and prayer, the symbolic pressure of that location was enormous. A knight living near the imagined remains of Solomon's temple did not need to discover anything for later generations to believe he must have. Some places are so charged that people cannot accept ordinary explanations for what happened there. The Temple Mount was one of them. For Jews, it was bound to the memory of the first and second temples, covenant, sacrifice, destruction, and longing. For Christians, it was folded into biblical history and the drama of salvation. For Muslims, it held profound sacred importance as the noble sanctuary, associated with the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Templars lived near a layered sacred landscape, and later writers looked back at that fact with hungry eyes. They asked the question that legend always asks: what if proximity meant access? What if access meant discovery? What if discovery meant danger? From there, the imagination moves quickly underground. It places the knights beneath the surface, in chambers under holy stone, searching for relics, lost scriptures, architectural secrets, or genealogical records. In some versions, the Templars become guardians of the Holy Grail. In others, they preserve forbidden knowledge. In still others, they inherit wisdom older than the Bible, sometimes traced back toward Egypt. But when we return to the firmer ground of history, the picture changes. The Templars' documented work in the East was military, religious, logistical, and financial. They protected pilgrims, defended crusader states, managed properties, built and maintained strongholds, and participated in the conflicts that shaped the Latin East. Their world was one of strategy as much as spirituality. Food, horses, armor, ships, money, alliances, these mattered. A crusader order that ignored logistics would not last long enough to become mysterious. This is one of the quiet ironies of the Templar story. Their real achievement was organization, but organization is rarely satisfying to myth. Secret treasure is easier to imagine than accounting. Hidden bloodlines are more cinematic than supply chains. Yet the ability to move money, men, and resources across continents may have seemed almost magical to those outside the system. The Templars became powerful not because they had discovered a supernatural lineage, but because they mastered the machinery of medieval influence. And still, the myth found a way in. Because power without a clear public face invites deeper explanations. People do not like to believe that institutions become strong through paperwork, discipline, relationships, and accumulated privilege. They prefer a key, a hidden source, a secret engine. For the Templars, the Temple Mount provided the perfect imagined engine. Their wealth and status could be explained not only by donations and papal favor, but by something they had found. Perhaps a relic, perhaps a text, perhaps the proof of an older sacred kingship, perhaps in later and more speculative forms, a line reaching back to Horus. Here we should pause over the word sought. What did the Templars seek? On the historical level, they sought to fulfill their mission, to defend pilgrims and preserve the crusader presence in the Holy Land. On the institutional level, they sought survival, influence, and resources. On the spiritual level, many likely sought salvation through service, discipline, and sacrifice, according to the ideals of their age. But on the legendary level, they sought what every secret history tradition wants its heroes to seek: the hidden origin of authority. That is why the Templars are so easily pulled toward Egypt in later imagination. Egypt represents age. The temple represents sacred legitimacy. Horus represents divine kingship. Combine them, and the medieval order becomes more than a military brotherhood. It becomes the missing link between ancient throne and Christian temple, between falcon and cross, between royal blood and holy guardianship. There is no need to pretend the evidence proves this. It does not. But the structure of the myth is revealing. Later writers were not randomly attaching Egypt to the Templars. They were trying to answer a question created by the order's own history. How did these men, who began as guardians of pilgrims, become so powerful, so feared, and so symbolically charged? The ordinary answer is history. The extraordinary answer is legend. And the story we are following lives in the tension between them. The Templars really did go east. They really did become associated with the temple. They really did operate in a world where sacred geography, royal memory, and religious conflict overlapped. Those facts do not open a buried chamber by themselves. But they do explain why later centuries kept imagining one. In the end, what the Templars sought in the East may be less mysterious than what later generations sought in the Templars. The order looked for roads to guard, lands to defend, and souls to save. The legend looked for something older beneath them. Chapter 6. The Temple Mount and the Buried Past. There are places where history does not lie in layers so much as press upward. The Temple Mount is one of them. To stand near it, even in imagination, is to feel how many worlds have claimed the same height. One tradition sees the place of ancient temples, sacrifice, priesthood, destruction, and longing. Another remembers episodes from the life and teaching of Jesus within the wider sacred geography of Jerusalem. Another honors it as one of Islam's most revered sanctuaries, crowned by architecture that transformed the skyline of the city. No single story can exhaust it. That is precisely why the Temple Mount became so powerful in later Templar mystery traditions. It was never merely a backdrop. It was a concentration of sacred memory, political authority, and unresolved absence. Something had stood there. Something had been destroyed there. Something had been rebuilt there. Something had been claimed there by one empire after another. And in the imagination, where there is sacred loss, there is almost always a buried remnant. The Templars entered this landscape not as neutral observers, but as men of their age. They inherited a Christian reading of Jerusalem shaped by scripture, pilgrimage, crusade, and triumph. To them, the city was not simply important. It was proof that sacred history could be touched. A stone was not just a stone if it could be connected to Solomon, Christ, prophecy, or judgment. The physical city became a kind of vast memory device. Their association with the area of the temple gave the order its name and much of its symbolic charge. Later generations would take that association and stretch it. If these knights were stationed near the site of the ancient temple, then perhaps they had access to spaces other men did not. If they had access, perhaps they explored. If they explored, perhaps they found something. And if they found something, perhaps the whole shape of Christian history was more fragile than it appeared. That chain of reasoning is seductive. It is also not proof. What it shows is how legends are built from proximity. The Templars did not need to leave behind a document saying, "We discovered a forbidden genealogy beneath the Temple Mount," for later writers to imagine it. The location did much of the work for them. In a story, the Order's headquarters near sacred ground becomes an invitation. The earth below the knights becomes as important as the vows above them. The buried past could be many things, depending on the century doing the imagining. For some, it was treasure, gold, vessels, relics, objects taken from the ancient temple and hidden before catastrophe. For others, it was knowledge, architectural secrets, lost scriptures, maps of sacred power, perhaps even evidence of a lineage that challenged official authority. In more speculative traditions, that imagined knowledge expanded until it could contain almost anything: the Grail, the blood of sacred kings, teachings brought from Egypt, or a chain of initiation older than the church. This is where the story begins to darken, not because the facts become stronger, but because the possibilities become more useful. A relic can enrich a church. A document can disturb one. A genealogy can threaten a throne. That is why hidden bloodlines appear so often in legends of sacred places. They turn stone into evidence. They suggest that authority is not where official institutions say it is. They imply that somewhere beneath the visible order lies another order, older and perhaps more legitimate. The Temple Mount was almost perfectly suited to that kind of thinking. It was already connected to kingship through Solomon and Davidic memory. It was connected to priesthood through the ancient temple. It was connected to divine presence through traditions of sacred dwelling. It was connected to conquest because control of Jerusalem was never only military. It was symbolic possession of a story. Whoever held the heights seemed, for a time, to hold the center of the world. The Templars were not kings, but they stood near the memory of kings. They were not priests in the ancient Israelite sense, but they lived under a religious rule. They were not builders of Solomon's temple, but their name made them sound like its heirs. This ambiguity is where myth thrives, and into that ambiguity, later writers could insert Egypt, not clumsily, but with a kind of symbolic logic. Egypt had its own tradition of divine kingship. Jerusalem had its sacred monarchy and temple memory. The Templars stood between the two worlds in the medieval imagination, armed guardians near holy ground, moving through the eastern Mediterranean, later accused of secret rites, later destroyed in a scandal that seemed to demand explanation. Once the Temple Mount became a suspected hiding place, the nature of the hidden thing could change with each generation. In one age it might be the Ark, in another, the Grail, in another, a royal bloodline, in another, evidence of ancient wisdom traveling from Egypt into biblical tradition and then into medieval secrecy. The recurring pattern is more important than any single version. The legend keeps insisting that visible religion is incomplete without something concealed beneath it. But careful history asks a colder question. What do we actually know? We know the Templars were associated with the site. We know the Temple Mount was, and remains, a place of immense religious significance. We know later traditions imagined discoveries there. We know secrecy, wealth, and sudden destruction made the order vulnerable to stories of hidden knowledge. What we do not have is firm evidence that the Templars uncovered a buried genealogy of sacred kings, Egyptian or otherwise. The absence of proof does not make the legend meaningless. It changes what kind of meaning we should look for. Instead of asking only, did they find it? We should ask, why did people need them to have found it? The answer may lie in the emotional power of buried things. A buried object suggests that the past is not gone, only withheld. A buried document suggests that truth has been delayed. A buried lineage suggests that rightful power has been hidden from the world. These ideas are intoxicating because they turn history into a puzzle with moral stakes. The seeker is not merely curious, he is recovering what was stolen. The Temple Mount intensifies that feeling because it is not an ordinary archaeological space. It is sacred to living traditions. Its meanings are not safely dead. They are prayed over, argued over, defended, and mourned. Any legend attached to it inherits that charge. This is why Templar stories centered on the temple can feel more powerful than stories set almost anywhere else. A secret found beneath a random castle would be interesting. A secret found beneath the imagined center of sacred history becomes explosive. And yet the most responsible way to read the legend is not to treat the Temple Mount as a treasure chest waiting for our preferred theory. It is to see it as a place where memory has accumulated so densely that later imagination could hardly resist digging. The Templars may have guarded pilgrims. They may have prayed, trained, managed supplies, argued over money, cared for horses, feared defeat, and performed the daily work of a military order. But because they stood near the idea of the temple, they became something else after death. Guardians of the unseen foundation. Not necessarily in fact, powerfully in myth. And in the long afterlife of the order, that difference often mattered less than it should have. For the legend of Horus and the Templars, the Temple Mount provides the chamber where everything can be hidden. It connects sacred kingship to sacred architecture, lost authority to buried evidence, and medieval secrecy to ancient memory. It does not prove the bloodline, but it gives the bloodline a place to sleep. Chapter 7. Egypt in the Templar imagination. Egypt entered the Templar story like a memory returning in a dream, not all at once, not cleanly, not through a single document that can be placed on a table and pointed to as the beginning. It came through association, through fascination, through the slow work of later writers who looked at the Knights Templar and saw more than a medieval order. They saw a locked door, and behind that door, they began placing the things their own age desired: hidden wisdom, forbidden rites, ancient symbols, and a kind of sacred authority that seemed older than the church itself. To understand this, we have to separate two Egypts. The first Egypt was historical, a civilization of dynasties, temples, priests, administrators, farmers, soldiers, scribes, and kings who lived within a worldview far more complex than the fragments later ages inherited. The second Egypt was imagined, a land of mysteries, hieroglyphs, initiations, cosmic secrets, and priest-kings guarding knowledge from the unready. The Templars were eventually drawn into the second Egypt. That does not mean they actually studied ancient Egyptian religion in any deep or accurate way. In fact, for much of the medieval period, Egypt's ancient writing systems were not understood by Europeans in the way they would be after the modern decipherment of hieroglyphs. Much of what later Europe believed about Egyptian wisdom came through Greek and Roman authors, biblical memory, late antique traditions, medieval speculation, and eventually Renaissance and occult reinterpretation. This is important because the Egypt attached to the Templars is usually not the Egypt of careful archaeology. It is Egypt as symbol, a symbol of antiquity, a symbol of hidden priesthood, a symbol of knowledge sealed inside images no one could fully read. There is a strange advantage in not understanding something. When a civilization leaves behind monuments that endure but meanings that become inaccessible, imagination rushes into the gap. A temple wall covered in unread signs does not feel meaningless. It feels encoded. A statue of a falcon-headed god does not seem like the remnant of a specific religious world. It becomes a clue. This is how Egypt became useful to esoteric storytelling. It offered depth. It offered age. It offered a language of sacred kingship that could be detached from its original setting and made to serve later mysteries. The pharaoh became not only a ruler, but the image of a hidden royal principle. The priest became not only a temple functionary, but the guardian of initiation. The god became not only part of a living cult, but a symbol waiting to be reinterpreted. Horus, especially, was easy to transform. In Egyptian tradition, Horus belonged to kingship, legitimacy, inheritance, and the victory of rightful order over violence and chaos. In later imagination, those themes could be simplified into a single alluring idea. There was once a divine line of rulers, and perhaps its memory survived. The Templars, already tied to the temple, secrecy, crusade, and downfall, became a convenient vessel for that memory. But convenient is not the same as true. The evidence is thinner here than the legend wants it to be. We do not possess solid medieval records showing the Templars consciously preserving an Egyptian doctrine of Horus or claiming descent from pharaonic sacred kingship. When that claim appears, it is usually part of much later patterns of speculation, where the order is reimagined through the concerns of writers far removed from the 12th and 13th centuries. Those later writers were often less interested in what the Templars had actually done than in what the Templars could represent. And they could represent a great deal. They could be martyrs betrayed by kings. They could be heretics who knew too much. They could be guardians of the Grail. They could be ancestors of secret societies. They could be the missing bridge between biblical religion and older mysteries. Once an order becomes symbolic enough, it can be recruited into almost any hidden history. Egypt made that hidden history feel ancient. Without Egypt, Templar legend might remain a medieval conspiracy. Knights, treasure, trials, and vanished wealth. With Egypt, the story expands backward into deep time. Suddenly, the question is no longer just what the Templars found in Jerusalem, but whether Jerusalem itself was part of a much older chain of sacred authority stretching toward the Nile. This is where the legend becomes emotionally powerful. It suggests that history is not a sequence of disconnected civilizations, but a secret inheritance passed from temple to temple, throne to throne, initiate to initiate. Egypt hands something to Israel. Israel hands something to Christian guardians. The guardians hide it. The modern seeker uncovers it. It is a beautiful structure. It is also exactly the kind of structure we should distrust when it becomes too smooth. Real transmission is usually messier. Ideas change language. Symbols are misunderstood. Rituals are broken, adapted, condemned, revived, and reinvented. A symbol that looks continuous may actually be reborn several times under different meanings. The falcon of Horus, the biblical king, the Crusader temple, and the occult lodge may all speak about sacred authority. But that does not mean they belong to one uninterrupted institution. Still, the comparison reveals something real about human culture. Across many societies, power wants to appear older than the person holding it. A ruler prefers to be seen not as an accident, but as an heir. A priesthood prefers continuity. A military order prefers sacred purpose. A secret society prefers ancestry. Even a modern conspiracy theory wants roots deep enough to make disbelief feel shallow. Egypt supplies those roots almost too well. Its antiquity gives legends weight. Its monuments give them scenery. Its gods give them symbols. Its kings give them blood. And because much of its ancient world was misunderstood for centuries, it could be reshaped again and again into whatever hidden wisdom later ages were seeking. The Templars, in turn, supplied drama. They had vows. They had wealth. They had enemies. They had a sudden fall. They left behind accusations, confessions of doubtful reliability, and just enough institutional secrecy to keep suspicion alive. Place Egypt behind them, and their story no longer ends with dissolution. It becomes a survival myth. The order dies. The knowledge escapes. The bloodline continues. The symbol waits. That pattern is not history in the strict sense. It is myth-making. But myth-making is not meaningless. It tells us what later generations believed was missing from official history. They wanted a hidden source behind authority. They wanted the sacred and the political to be secretly joined. They wanted the ruins of Egypt and the stones of Jerusalem to belong to a single design. The danger comes when symbolic connection is mistaken for documentary proof. A serpent in one tradition is not automatically the same serpent in another. A star carved in one context does not necessarily refer to a secret doctrine elsewhere. A temple is not always a coded memory of every temple before it. Human beings reuse shapes because certain images are powerful, simple, and available. Similarity can suggest influence, but it cannot carry the whole argument by itself. So when Egypt appears in the Templar imagination, we should neither mock it nor surrender to it. We should read it carefully. It is not a reliable map of what the medieval order knew. It is a map of what later seekers hoped the medieval order had preserved. And at the center of that map is a longing that beneath crusade, beneath church politics, beneath ruined sanctuaries and trial records, there remained a deeper tradition of sacred kingship, one that began under the falcon's eye and somehow survived beneath the cross. That is the Egypt the Templars inherited in legend. Not necessarily the Egypt of the pharaohs, the Egypt of hidden meaning. Chapter 8. The bloodline as myth, memory, and power. A bloodline sounds like something simple, a line of descent, a chain of bodies. One generation passing into the next with names, marriages, inheritances, and claims that can be written down, challenged, forged, defended, or erased. But in stories of sacred power, blood is rarely just blood. It becomes memory. It becomes proof. It becomes a weapon. When later legends speak of a hidden bloodline of Horus, the phrase invites us to imagine a biological secret, preserved across impossible centuries, carried through dynasties, temples, deserts, and hidden orders until it reaches the hands of the Templars. That is the cinematic version. It has the clean shape of a thriller. Someone has the blood, someone hides the blood, someone hunts the blood, someone finally reveals the truth. History is not usually so considerate. What we find again and again, across cultures, is not a single secret family moving untouched through time, but the use of ancestry as a language of authority. Bloodline becomes a way to say, this power is not new, this throne is not accidental, this office was not seized yesterday by force. It descends from something older, something sacred, something difficult to question without also questioning the order of the world. That is why bloodline legends are so persistent. They do political work while pretending to be memory. A king who claims descent from a divine ancestor is doing more than telling a family story. He is building a shield around his rule. A priesthood that claims ancient inheritance is protecting its rituals from rivals. A noble house that traces itself to heroic founders is not merely honoring the dead. It is negotiating status among the living. Even when the genealogy is sincere, it is never neutral. It tells people where to kneel, or at least where not to ask too many questions. In ancient Egypt, the connection between kingship and divine order gave descent extraordinary significance, but it did not reduce legitimacy to a private genetic fact. The pharaoh's authority had to be visible, ritualized, named, crowned, and recognized. It had to be placed within the cosmic order. A ruler was not legitimate simply because some hidden blood test, had such a thing existed, would have said so. He had to become the living bearer of kingship in public and sacred terms. That is a subtle point, and later myths often flatten it. They take an ancient idea of divine kingship and turn it into a secret family code. The same flattening happens in medieval and biblical traditions. Descent matters. Chosen lineages matter. Royal houses matter. But blood alone rarely explains everything. Anointing, covenant, recognition, conquest, marriage, prophecy, clerical approval, and political necessity all shape who is considered rightful. The line is never only biological. It is narrated into power. A bloodline must be believed. That belief can be maintained through documents, ceremonies, monuments, songs, temple rituals, court historians, heraldry, marriage alliances, and, when necessary, violence. The body may carry dissent, but society carries meaning. Without recognition, sacred blood is only a private claim. With recognition, it can become law. This is where the Templar myth becomes revealing. The idea that the Templars preserved a bloodline of Horus is weak as literal history, but strong as symbolic storytelling. It imagines the order as custodian of a legitimacy older than the visible institutions of medieval Europe. In that version, the Templars do not merely guard pilgrims or fortresses. They guard the hidden source from which kingship itself once drew its authority. That is a much larger role than the records give them. But it explains the appeal. A military religious order is already a bridge between categories. The Templars were neither ordinary monks nor ordinary knights. They were poor in vow, yet wealthy in property. Obedient in theory, yet internationally powerful in practice. Their identity seemed to violate the usual boundaries. A group like that almost begs later imagination to assign it a secret purpose. Bloodline legends supply that purpose elegantly. They answer the question of why an order might have needed secrecy. They explain why rulers might fear it. They transform financial and political conflict into metaphysical struggle. A king does not destroy the Templars because he owes them money or resents their independence. He destroys them because they know the truth about sacred authority. It is a far more satisfying story, even if satisfaction is not evidence, and that is the trap. The more satisfying a theory becomes, the more carefully we should examine it. A hidden bloodline can explain everything because it is almost impossible to disprove in the imagination. Missing documents become proof of suppression. Lack of evidence becomes evidence of secrecy. Contradictions become deliberate disguises. The legend becomes a locked room whose key is always said to have been stolen. That does not make every bloodline tradition false. It means bloodline stories require discipline. We have to ask what kind of claim is being made. Is it genealogical? Symbolic? Political? Ritual? Literary? Is it based on records from the period, or on much later interpretation? Does it explain the evidence, or does it absorb the absence of evidence and call that mystery? In the case of Horus and the Templars, the strongest reading is not biological, it is ideological. The blood may be a metaphor for continuity, the continuity of sacred kingship, temple guardianship, hidden legitimacy, and divine order. A tradition does not need to pass through veins to survive. It can pass through symbols, through architecture, through names, through stories told by people who believe the present is secretly dependent on the ancient past. This kind of inheritance is less dramatic than a concealed royal child, but it is more historically plausible. Ideas do travel. They are translated, misunderstood, condemned, revived, and repurposed. Symbols detach from their original homes and acquire new meanings. A falcon can become an emblem of divine sight. A temple can become a model for cosmic order. A royal lineage can become a mythic language for spiritual authority. None of this proves an uninterrupted chain from pharaoh to Templar knight, but it does show how ancient power can be reimagined in later worlds. Bloodline, then, becomes a story people tell when they want continuity to feel alive. It is not enough for them to say, "This idea resembles an older idea." They want to say, This idea descends from it. Descent feels stronger than resemblance. It gives history a spine. It turns coincidence into inheritance and influence into destiny. That is why secret genealogies thrive in moments of distrust. When official institutions seem corrupt, incomplete, or too ordinary, a hidden line offers another source of legitimacy. It says the visible world is not the real world. The true heirs are elsewhere. The Templars became perfect candidates for that elsewhere. They were destroyed, but not forgotten. Accused, but not fully understood. Powerful, but no longer present to defend or clarify themselves. Their absence made them available. Later writers could make them heirs of Solomon, guardians of the Grail, carriers of Egyptian wisdom, or protectors of the bloodline of Horus. The Order's historical silence became a kind of blank parchment. But perhaps the most important thing about sacred bloodlines is not whether they are true. It is what they reveal about fear. People invent or preserve these stories because power feels unstable without origin. If authority begins only yesterday, it can be taken tomorrow. But if it descends from gods, kings, temples, or hidden ancestors, it seems harder to overthrow. It becomes part of the world's deep structure. That is the promise of the Horus line. Not simply that someone, somewhere, carries ancient blood, but that beneath the disorder of history, there is a line that never broke. A thread of sacred legitimacy running under conquest, conversion, betrayal, and ruin. A way to believe that power has a source older than politics. For the careful historian, this is not proof. For the storyteller, it is almost irresistible. And for the viewer willing to sit between skepticism and wonder, it offers a sharper insight. The most enduring bloodlines may not be carried in bodies at all. They are carried in the human need to make authority feel ancient, chosen, and hidden just beyond reach. Chapter 9. The Hidden Genealogy of Sacred Kings. There is a reason kings so often surround themselves with ancestors, not just parents and grandparents, whose names can be remembered by ordinary people, but ancestors who stand at the edge of history. Founders, heroes, prophets, gods, chosen men, chosen women, figures half lit by memory and half constructed by need. A throne is never only a chair. It is an argument. Whoever sits there must explain why he belongs there and why others do not. Force can place a ruler on the throne, but force alone rarely keeps him safe. Sooner or later, power looks backward. It searches for a beginning that feels older than ambition. It reaches for a genealogy. This is where ancient Egypt and the medieval imagination unexpectedly speak to one another. In Egypt, kingship was framed through divine order. The pharaoh was associated with Horus in life and with Osiris in death. His authority was not presented as a mere convenience of government. It was part of the way the world was meant to function. The king stood at the crossing point between earth and heaven, ritual and rule, human body and divine office. To say that the pharaoh was Horus was not just flattery. It was a claim about reality. The ruler maintained Ma'at. He protected the land from chaos. He renewed the bond between gods and people. His blood could matter, but his office mattered even more, because kingship had to be continually performed. A king who failed to embody order was not simply unpopular. He became a crack in the sacred design. That idea may feel distant, but it did not vanish from human history. It changed clothes. In biblical tradition, kingship often carries a different theological shape. but the concern with chosen lineage remains powerful. The House of David becomes one of the great models of sacred descent. Here, authority is not expressed through the falcon crown or the divine office of Horus, but through covenant, anointing, promise, and the belief that a particular line has been marked for a purpose larger than ordinary politics. The Davidic line is not Egyptian kingship in disguise. We should not collapse different traditions into one another, just because they both speak the language of sacred rule. Their gods, rituals, texts, and historical contexts are not interchangeable, but the comparison is still useful. Both traditions understand that rule needs more than strength. It needs meaning. In Egypt, that meaning was cosmic order. In the biblical model, it was election, covenant, and divine promise. In medieval Europe, kingship would develop still other languages: anointing with holy oil, coronation rites, dynastic marriage, relics, royal saints, public ceremony, and the blessing or resistance of the church. The king became legitimate not because one fact proved him so, but because many signs gathered around him: blood, oil, crown, name, memory, recognition. Each sign reinforced the others. This is why hidden genealogies are so potent. They take the visible signs of rule and suggest that there is another sign underneath them, one older, purer, and more dangerous. A public king may wear the crown, but the hidden heir carries the true blood. A church may bless a ruler, but an older sacred line may stand behind or beneath the institution. A dynasty may claim legitimacy, but a forbidden document may prove another descent. The Templar legend feeds on exactly this possibility. Because the order was tied to the Temple Mount, later imagination placed it near the symbolic sources of sacred kingship: Solomon, David, priesthood, covenant, temple architecture, and divine presence. Because the order operated in the Eastern Mediterranean, later imagination could push its story toward Egypt and the older model of Horus, the living principle of kingship. Because the order was destroyed under accusation, later imagination could suggest that what it guarded had threatened the visible powers of Europe. The result is a hidden genealogy of sacred kings. Not a genealogy we can verify in the ordinary sense, a genealogy of ideas. Egypt gives the myth its deep past, the divine ruler as embodiment of cosmic order. Jerusalem gives it its biblical center: chosen kingship, sacred temple, covenantal memory. Medieval Europe gives it its political theater: crusader orders, royal ambitions, church authority, dynastic legitimacy. The Templars become the imagined carriers moving between these worlds. This does not mean they truly possessed such a chain. It means the chain is assembled around them because they are useful to the story. They sit in the right place. They fall at the right moment. They leave behind the right kind of silence. A more cautious reading would say that sacred kingship is a recurring human pattern, not necessarily a single hidden tradition. Many cultures develop ways to make authority appear divine, ancestral, or cosmically necessary. They do this because rulership is always vulnerable to the accusation that it is merely human. Sacred genealogy protects power from that accusation. If a king is only a man, he can be replaced by another man. If he is the bearer of a divine line, replacing him becomes a wound in the world. That is the psychological force behind these claims. Sacred kingship turns political obedience into participation in order. It asks people not only to accept rule, but to see rule as connected to the structure of reality. Of course, this can be beautiful or dangerous. Beautiful, because it can bind a society to ideals of justice, duty, continuity, and responsibility before the divine. Dangerous, because it can make power almost immune to criticism. A ruler who claims heaven as his ancestor may not enjoy being reminded that crops have failed, taxes are unbearable, and his cousin would make a better administrator. Sacred blood can inspire reverence. It can also excuse very ordinary incompetence. This small human truth is often missing from grand myths. They prefer the shining line, the hidden heir, the ancient promise. But every sacred genealogy eventually has to pass through actual people. Anxious rulers, ambitious courtiers, frightened priests, scribes with political instincts, families protecting inheritance, and institutions trying to survive. Divine kingship may speak in cosmic language, but it is lived in human rooms. That is why the Templar version is so revealing. It imagines a pure inheritance, but attaches it to one of the most complicated institutions of the medieval world. The Templars were not wandering philosophers preserving an abstract doctrine of sacred monarchy. They were landholders, fighters, administrators, debt holders, fortress managers, and vowed religious men. Their world was not only mystical, it was practical, expensive, and often brutal. Yet precisely because they were practical, the legend gives them a secret to make them more than practical. It transforms management into guardianship. It transforms proximity to the temple into access to forbidden origins. It transforms destruction by political power into martyrdom for hidden truth. The hidden genealogy, therefore, tells us less about a secret family and more about the hunger for an authority deeper than public records. It is a way of arranging history so that Egypt, Israel, Christianity, and the medieval orders form one long sacred corridor. Horus stands near the beginning. David and Solomon stand near the middle. The Templars stand at the guarded door. Modern seekers stand outside, listening for movement within. But real history is not a corridor built by a single architect. It is a city of additions, collapses, reused stones, mistranslations, renovations, and locked gates whose keys have been lost for reasons much less dramatic than conspiracy. That does not make the comparison worthless. It makes it more honest. Horus, Davidic lineage, and medieval anointed kingship all show how societies make power sacred. They reveal different answers to the same underlying question. Why should this ruler be obeyed? One answer points to cosmic order, another to divine promise, another to sacramental ceremony and dynastic rite. The Templar legend imagines that these answers are secretly connected. The evidence cannot carry that claim as literal history, but as myth, it is remarkably coherent. It says that sacred kingship never truly died. It only changed its symbols. The falcon became the anointed king. The temple became the cathedral, the fortress, the hidden chamber. The blood became not merely descent, but the idea that legitimacy can pass beneath the visible surface of events. And perhaps that is the real hidden genealogy. Not a list of names, a recurring human strategy. Whenever authority feels uncertain, people search backward for a sacred beginning. They ask the past to bless the present. They turn rulers into heirs of something older than politics. And when the official story feels insufficient, they imagine another lineage waiting in the dark, older, purer, and powerful enough to explain why the world still trembles before crowns. Chapter 10. Clues, Symbols, and Dangerous Interpretations. Symbols are dangerous because they look as if they are always trying to tell us something. A serpent carved into stone, a star placed above a doorway, a temple aligned to the heavens, a cup, a cross, a crown, a sealed chamber, a strange face on a wall. Each one seems to lean toward the viewer and whisper, not in words exactly, but in suggestion. The human mind is very good at finishing unfinished patterns, sometimes too good. This is the difficulty with Templar symbolism. The order lived in a world full of signs. Medieval Christianity was not visually plain. It spoke through crosses, seals, colors, gestures, relics, architecture, feast days, processions, and sacred numbers. A knight's mantle was not just clothing. A seal was not just branding. A church plan was not just practical design. Symbols carried theology, identity, hierarchy, and memory. But not every symbol is a confession. That is the first rule we need to keep close. The Templars certainly had documented symbols. The red cross on the white mantle became their most recognizable sign, expressing both purity of vow and readiness for martyrdom in the language of their own tradition. Their seals carried institutional meaning. Their churches and fortifications belonged to the architectural and religious world of the medieval Latin East and Europe. These signs do not need a hidden Egyptian explanation to matter. They already mattered. Later interpreters, however, often treat symbols as if they were puzzle pieces from one enormous secret code. A serpent appears here, a star appears there, a temple image appears somewhere else. And suddenly a line is drawn between Egypt, Jerusalem, the Templars, sacred blood, and forbidden initiation. The result can feel persuasive because the images are powerful. But power is not the same as context. A serpent in ancient Egypt might carry one meaning. A serpent in biblical tradition might carry another. A serpent in medieval Christian art might carry another still. And a serpent in modern occult symbolism may carry several meanings at once, some ancient, some invented, some borrowed, some misunderstood. To collapse all of them into one secret doctrine is not interpretation. It is flattening. The same is true of stars. The heavens mattered deeply to ancient peoples. Celestial order was tied to calendars, agriculture, kingship, ritual, navigation, and prophecy. Egypt looked to the sky. Biblical writers looked to the sky. Medieval Christians looked to the sky. But shared attention to stars does not automatically prove shared initiation. Human beings everywhere look upward. The sky is the oldest ceiling we have. Temples create similar trouble. The word itself carries enormous weight. In one context, a temple is a house of a god. In another, it is the memory of Solomon's sanctuary. In another, it becomes a metaphor for the body, the church, or the cosmos. For the Templars, the temple was central to identity because of their association with Jerusalem and the sacred history attached to that place. But later writers often expand the idea until every temple becomes part of a hidden chain. Egyptian temple, Jerusalem temple, Templar headquarters, secret lodge, modern mystery school. It is an elegant chain. Too elegant, perhaps. Real symbols rarely move through history in perfect formation. They scatter, break, reappear, and change meanings depending on who uses them. A symbol can survive while its original explanation dies. It can be adopted by people who do not understand it as its creators did. It can be deliberately reinterpreted. It can also be coincidental, which is the least romantic explanation and therefore often the least popular. This does not mean we should ignore symbolic echoes. It means we should ask better questions. Instead of asking, "Does this symbol prove the Templars knew the bloodline of Horus?" we might ask, "Who used this symbol, when, and in what setting? Was it common in the period? Does it appear in Templar records, or only in later accounts? Is the meaning documented or assumed? Are we reading medieval Christianity through the desires of modern occultism?" These questions do not kill mystery. They protect it from becoming nonsense. The symbol of sacred blood is especially vulnerable to dangerous interpretation. Blood has always been emotionally intense. It can mean life, kinship, sacrifice, violence, covenant, inheritance, purity, guilt, salvation, or royal descent. In Christian tradition, blood carries profound theological meaning through sacrifice and redemption. In dynastic politics, blood marks family right. In occult speculation, blood becomes the carrier of hidden power. In racial ideology, it can become poisonous. That last point must not be avoided. Bloodline myths can turn ugly when they become claims about inherent superiority, secret purity, or chosen biology. The idea of a sacred lineage can be poetic when treated as symbolic continuity. It becomes dangerous when used to divide human beings into higher and lower forms, rightful rulers and lesser blood, hidden elites and disposable masses. A careful telling of the Horus Templar legend has to resist that temptation. The most responsible reading of the bloodline is not racial, not biological destiny, and not proof of a secret caste. It is a myth about legitimacy. The belief that sacred authority can pass from one age to another beneath the visible surface of history. That belief may be fascinating, but it should not be romanticized without caution. The Templars themselves were accused of secret practices after their fall, and those accusations shaped later interpretations of their symbols. Once an institution is branded suspicious, everything about it begins to look encoded. A closed ceremony becomes a forbidden rite. A strange image becomes an idol. A rumor becomes testimony. A symbol becomes evidence before it has been understood. This is how fear reads. It does not ask what a sign meant to the people who used it. It asks what the sign can be made to prove. During and after the Templar trials, fragments of accusation would attach themselves to the order like burrs on a cloak. Hidden worship, denial, strange heads, obscene rites, secret teachings. The reliability of these claims is a serious problem, especially where pressure and torture were involved. But once written into the memory of the order, they became a reservoir for later myth. A serpent could be made Egyptian. A head could be made oracular. A star could be made initiatory. A cross could be made a disguise. And sacred blood could be made the hidden reason for everything. This is not how evidence should work, but it is often how legend works. The more ambiguous the symbol, the more confidently people claim to decode it. Ambiguity becomes a mirror. The interpreter finds what he brought with him. A devout medieval observer may see a sign of martyrdom. An Enlightenment critic may see superstition. A romantic occultist may see initiation. A conspiracy theorist may see proof of suppression. The object stays still. The meanings gather around it like weather. So where does that leave us? With caution, but not emptiness. The symbols attached to the Templar mystery do reveal something important. They show how the order became a meeting place for different dreams of sacred power. The cross tied them to Christian sacrifice. The temple tied them to biblical kingship and divine presence. The desert tied them to testing and passage. Egypt tied them to antiquity and hidden wisdom. Horus tied them to divine monarchy. Blood tied them to inheritance and legitimacy. Each symbol added a layer. Together, they created a myth dense enough to feel ancient, even when much of its structure was assembled later. The danger is believing that density equals proof. A legend can be symbolically rich and historically fragile at the same time. In fact, many of the most enduring legends are exactly that. They survive because they offer meaning, not because every link can be verified. They allow people to imagine that history has a hidden grammar, that every sign belongs to a concealed sentence, that every ruined temple and every fallen order is part of one long message. But symbols do not speak alone. We make them speak, and the voice we give them often reveals as much about us as about the past. Chapter 11. The Templars and the Charge of Heresy. The end of the Templars did not begin with a battlefield. That is one of the stranger facts about their story. For an order built around war, sacrifice, and the defense of holy places, their destruction came through paperwork, arrests, interrogations, royal pressure, and the slow machinery of accusation. No final Crusader banner fell in one clean, cinematic moment. No last charge settled their fate. Instead, the order was taken apart by a kind of violence that leaves ink stains before it leaves ruins. By the early 14th century, the world that had made the Templars necessary had changed. The Crusader states had suffered catastrophic losses. The Latin Christian presence in the Holy Land had weakened and then collapsed in its old form. Orders like the Templars and Hospitallers still possessed wealth, land, and military prestige, but the original urgency that had justified their rise was harder to maintain. A military order without Jerusalem became an uncomfortable question. What was it for now? That question alone did not destroy the Templars, but it made them vulnerable. They had become rich, international, and privileged. They held properties across Europe. They had financial dealings with kings and nobles. They answered to papal authority in ways that could place them beyond the easy reach of local rulers. To supporters, this made them valuable servants of Christendom. To enemies, it made them arrogant, secretive, and dangerously independent. And then there was the King of France. Philip IV was not a man inclined to leave power lying on the table. His conflict with the Templars unfolded in a political world where monarchy was growing more ambitious and more bureaucratic. Kings wanted control. They wanted money. They wanted obedience. An order with wealth, autonomy, and a reputation for secrecy was not merely inconvenient. It was tempting. The accusations, when they came, were devastating. The Templars were charged with heresy, denial of Christ, obscene initiation practices, idol worship, improper kisses, and other offenses designed not just to discredit them, but to make them appear spiritually monstrous. These were not mild criticisms of institutional corruption. They were accusations aimed at the soul of the order. If true, they meant the Templars had not merely failed. They had inverted the faith they claimed to serve. That is why the charges mattered so much to later legend. A corrupt financial institution can be hated. A failed military order can be dissolved. but a secret heretical brotherhood can haunt the imagination for centuries. The problem is that the evidence behind the charges is deeply troubled. Many confessions were extracted under pressure, and some under torture. Testimony produced in fear is not the same as truth. Men who believe pain will stop if they say what interrogators want may say nearly anything. Later retractions and inconsistencies only deepen the problem. The trial records are real, but reality on paper does not guarantee reliability in fact. This is one of the most important distinctions in the entire Templar story. The accusations existed. That does not mean the accusations were true. Yet once written, repeated, and dramatized, they became part of the Order's afterlife. The Templars were no longer only the protectors of pilgrims or the bankers of kings. They became men who might have bowed to a mysterious head, mocked the cross, kissed in strange ceremonies, or preserved a forbidden teaching. Even if those claims were exaggerated, coerced, or fabricated, they created an atmosphere that later writers could enter and enlarge. Secrecy did the rest. Every closed institution has internal rituals. Religious orders have rules of admission. Military brotherhoods have oaths. Initiation creates belonging precisely because it is not open to everyone. But when trust collapses, initiation becomes suspicious, a vow becomes a threat, a kiss of peace becomes a coded act. A private ceremony becomes the perfect place for outsiders to imagine evil. That is how ordinary secrecy becomes legendary secrecy. The Templars' downfall also coincided with a deeper anxiety about hidden corruption within sacred institutions. Medieval Christianity was not naive about sin inside holy places. It had language for false monks, corrupt clergy, demonic deception, and heresy disguised as devotion. The horror of the Templar charges lay in the idea that men wearing the sign of the cross might secretly betray it behind closed doors. This made the scandal powerful even for those who doubted parts of it. A secret enemy outside the faith is frightening. A secret enemy inside the armor of faith is worse. But political motive cannot be ignored. Philip IV had reasons to want the order weakened or destroyed. The Templars possessed resources. They had prestige. They were inconveniently independent. A monarch in need of money and control could benefit from their ruin. This does not automatically mean every accusation was invented from nothing, but it does mean the process cannot be treated as clean spiritual justice. Power often dresses its ambitions in moral clothing. That clothing can be sincere. It can also be useful. In the case of the Templars, the useful outcome was unmistakable. The order was dismantled. Its reputation was blackened. Its members were imprisoned, pressured, scattered, or absorbed into other arrangements, depending on place and circumstance. The grand mystery of the Templars was born not from their rise, but from the way their fall left so much unresolved. Were they guilty? Were they framed? Were some practices misunderstood? Were local irregularities inflated into universal corruption? Were frightened men repeating accusations fed to them? Were enemies turning the order's own secrecy into a weapon? The honest answer is not as satisfying as legend would like. It is probably not one single thing. The collapse of the Templars sits at the intersection of politics, fear, money, institutional rivalry, crusading failure, royal ambition, and religious suspicion. That complexity is less tidy than a secret Egyptian bloodline, but far more historically human. And still, the bloodline myth finds an opening here. If the Templars were destroyed under charges of heresy, later imagination can ask, What if heresy was only the official name for forbidden knowledge? What if the accusations were a mask? What if the king and church feared not corruption, but revelation? What if the order had discovered something beneath the Temple Mount? Something connected to sacred kingship, ancient Egypt, or a lineage that challenged existing authority? This is where speculation becomes seductive. Because the destruction of the order feels too large to be explained by debt, bureaucracy, and politics alone. People want the punishment to match a hidden crime or a hidden truth. They want the flames, the arrests, and the confessions to point toward a secret worthy of such violence. But history often disappoints that desire. Institutions have been destroyed for money. Men have been tortured for convenience. Reputations have been ruined because they stood in the way of someone more powerful. No ancient god is required. That may be the darker possibility. Not that the Templars were guardians of a world-shaking secret, but that they were vulnerable to the oldest machinery of power: accusation, extraction, confiscation, and control. Yet myth does not die there. It adapts. The heresy charges gave later generations a language of hidden worship. The political destruction gave them a villain. The unreliable confessions gave them fragments. The order's secrecy gave them atmosphere. And the Templars' association with the temple gave them a place to imagine the secret had begun. From this point forward, the Templars could no longer be only historical. They had been broken open by accusation, and into that wound later centuries poured symbols: the Grail, the idol, the serpent, the buried archive, the royal blood, the Egyptian inheritance, the shadow of Horus behind the cross. Whether the men themselves would have recognized any of this is another matter. Most probably would not. They might have recognized fear. They might have recognized interrogation. They might have recognized the bitterness of serving a sacred cause and being remembered as traitors to it. They might have recognized the awful speed with which a symbol can be turned against the person wearing it. The red cross on the mantle had once promised sacrifice. In the trial imagination, it became a possible disguise. That reversal is what made the legend endure. The Templars fell not quietly, but under accusations that made every earlier mystery appear darker. Once the order was branded heretical, everything about it could be reread. Their wealth, their discipline, their silence, their headquarters, their rituals, their Eastern contacts. All of it became suspicious. And suspicion, once attached to sacred history, is very hard to bury. Chapter 12. Confessions under fire. A confession can feel like the strongest form of evidence. A man speaks, his words are written down, the record survives. Centuries later, someone opens the file and sees, in black ink, what appears to be an admission from inside the order itself. But a confession is not a simple object. It has a temperature. It has a room around it. It has hands nearby. Questions repeated. Threats implied or spoken. Pain remembered. Fear of pain returning. And the terrible human instinct to survive the next hour. When we read the Templar confessions, we are not listening to calm testimony given in safety. We are listening through fire, pressure, imprisonment, and political expectation. Some men confessed, some denied, some changed their statements, some retracted. Some may have repeated what they thought interrogators wanted to hear. Others may have described distorted versions of real practices misunderstood by outsiders. The records preserve words, but they do not preserve freedom from fear. That is why this part of the story must be handled with unusual care. The accusations against the Templars included denial of Christ, during initiation, spitting on or dishonoring the cross, obscene kisses, idol worship, and secret rites. On the page, these charges seem shocking. They were meant to. Heresy trials were not designed to produce gentle ambiguity. They worked by forcing hidden corruption into visible language. They translated suspicion into confession. Yet the patterns in the evidence are unstable. If the Templars had possessed a coherent secret doctrine, one might expect the testimony to show a clear and consistent system. Instead, the surviving accusations often feel fragmentary, uneven, and shaped by the pressures of interrogation. This does not mean nothing irregular ever happened anywhere inside the order. Large institutions can contain local abuses, strange customs, hazing, power games, or private deviations. But the leap from troubled testimony to a universal hidden religion is too large to cross without stronger evidence. Later legend crossed it anyway. The trial records became a quarry. Writers searching for the secret of the Templars could take a fragment from one confession, a rumor from another, a strange object from a third, and build a temple of speculation around them. A mysterious head mentioned in testimony could become an idol, an oracle, a relic, a coded symbol of ancient wisdom. A denial of Christ could become proof of anti-Christian initiation. A closed ceremony could become the survival of an Egyptian mystery rite. A forced admission could become the crack through which hidden history shines. This is how coerced testimony becomes mythic material. It is not because the records are worthless. They are valuable. They show what the Templars were accused of, what authorities wanted to prove, what frightened men said under pressure, and how medieval institutions imagined religious betrayal. But they are dangerous when treated as transparent windows. They are more like broken glass. You can see through them in places, but the image is distorted and the edges cut. The human reality underneath is easy to lose. We speak of the Templars as if the order were one body, one mind, one secret. In the interrogation rooms there were individual men, some old, some frightened, some confused, some stubborn, some perhaps resentful, some desperately calculating what answer would keep them alive. They had joined an institution that promised spiritual purpose and brotherhood. Now that same institution was being described to them as a nest of blasphemy. Imagine the psychological collapse of that moment. A vow that once gave meaning becomes evidence. A ritual of entry becomes a crime scene. A brother's memory becomes a liability. Under such pressure, language itself begins to fail. Men may agree to words they do not fully accept. They may deny what they once said. They may shape memories to fit the accusation. They may confess to an act, but not its meaning. They may say something happened as a test, or as a form, or because others did it, without understanding how that nuance will vanish once later readers arrive hungry for certainty. This is why the confessions are fertile ground for legends about forbidden knowledge. They are full of suggestive fragments, but poor in stable explanation. And fragments are exactly what secret history traditions love most. A complete document can be checked. A clear doctrine can be debated. A fragment invites completion. It asks the reader to become a co-author. The less it explains, the more it can mean. In later Templar mythology, the alleged hidden worship became especially important. If the knights had worshipped something unknown, then perhaps they were not merely corrupt. Perhaps they had encountered another sacred power. Perhaps the thing called heresy by their enemies was actually an older truth. Perhaps the mysterious head, the strange rites, the rejection of ordinary symbols all pointed toward a non-Christian inheritance. From there, the road to Egypt is not long in the imagination. Egypt had gods with animal forms. Egypt had temple rituals. Egypt had sacred kings. Egypt had images that later Europeans often found enigmatic or unsettling. And Horus, with his falcon aspect and royal associations, could be placed into the gap as a symbol of hidden divine legitimacy. Not because the trial records prove it, but because the records leave enough darkness for later centuries to furnish the room. The danger is that this approach rewards the most dramatic interpretation simply because it is dramatic. A strange head becomes Horus. A secret rite becomes initiation. A denial becomes coded wisdom. A rumor becomes inheritance. But the responsible interpretation remains more restrained. The Templar confessions reveal a moment when institutional secrecy, royal ambition, religious fear, and coercive legal procedure converged. They show how an order could be transformed through accusation into its own negative image. The defenders of the cross became accused enemies of the cross. The guardians of pilgrims became suspected guardians of blasphemy. The men of the temple became men of the hidden idol. That reversal was powerful enough without adding Egypt. Yet Egypt gave the reversal a deeper shadow. It allowed later writers to imagine that the Templars had not simply betrayed Christianity, but had looked beneath it, toward a sacred authority older than the biblical world, older than the church, older than the cross on their mantles. In that version, the confessions are not the words of frightened men. They are leaks from a sealed tradition. This is almost certainly asking too much of them. Still, we can understand why the temptation persists. Trial records have an official seriousness. They look less like folklore than rumor told beside a fire. They carry the weight of law, names, procedure, and consequence. When legend attaches itself to such records, it gains the costume of evidence. A myth with a court document in its hand speaks more confidently, but the costume can deceive. The essential question is not merely, what did the records say? It is, how were those words produced, and who benefited from them? When we ask that, the Templar mystery changes shape. The confessions become less a hidden map to ancient Egypt, and more a study in how power manufactures truth. Authorities needed the order to be guilty. The accused needed to survive. Scribes needed answers. The public needed explanation, and later generations needed mystery. Each need left a mark. By the time the story reached modern occult speculation, the original human voices had been almost buried beneath interpretation. The frightened knight became an initiate. The interrogation chamber became a doorway. The accusation became a clue. The legal collapse became a sacred drama. That transformation should make us cautious, because the suffering of real people can become raw material for beautiful falsehoods. The Templars may have had secrets. Every closed order does. They may have had rituals outsiders found strange. They may have had members who failed their vows, or local practices that later investigators distorted. But the confessions do not securely reveal a preserved Horus bloodline. They reveal something colder and more useful to our investigation. How quickly secrecy becomes guilt when power decides to read it that way. And once guilt has been written down, myth can keep rewriting it forever. Chapter 13. From Trial Records to Occult Legend. After the Templars were dissolved, they did not disappear. Institutions can be ended by decree. Property can be transferred. Men can be imprisoned, released, absorbed into other orders, or left to vanish into local memory. But reputation is harder to bury. Once a story has gathered enough fear around it, it continues to move after the official body is gone. The Templars became more powerful in absence than they had ever been in life. Not politically, of course. The order no longer commanded fortresses or managed estates in the same way. Its official structure had been broken, but as a symbol, it became strangely free. No living institution could correct every rumor. No central voice remained to say, "That is not what we were." The dead do not issue clarifications, which is one reason legends prefer them. At first, the memory of the Templars remained tangled in the scandal of their trials. Their name carried accusation, pity, suspicion, admiration, and unease. Some saw them as guilty men exposed. Others saw them as victims of royal greed and political theater. Still others found the uncertainty itself irresistible. A destroyed order with wealth, secrecy, sacred geography, and contested confessions was almost designed to be reinterpreted. Over time, the question shifted. So, it was no longer simply, were the Templars guilty? It became, what did they know? That shift changed everything. Guilt belongs to the courtroom. Knowledge belongs to the hidden chamber. Once the Templars were imagined as possessors of secret knowledge, their entire history could be reread as a coded trail. Their presence in Jerusalem became a clue. Their association with the Temple Mount became evidence of discovery. Their wealth became the result of some hidden advantage. Their initiation rites became fragments of a deeper system. Their persecution became the response of frightened authorities trying to suppress what had been uncovered. The legend had learned to protect itself. If evidence appeared, it was confirmation. If evidence was absent, it had been hidden. If records contradicted the theory, the records were part of the suppression. This is how conspiracy traditions become durable. They create a world in which every objection feeds the story. The Templar myth would become especially good at this because it could borrow from many symbolic economies at once. Christian relic traditions, Grail romances, alchemical speculation, Masonic imagination, Rosicrucian atmosphere, Egyptian mystery, and modern alternative history. Each age found a different Templar. Medieval memory had the accused heretic. Romantic writers found the tragic martyr. Secret societies found the ancient initiate. Occult speculation found the guardian of lost wisdom. Modern conspiracy culture found the keeper of suppressed bloodlines. The historical order remained somewhere underneath all of these layers, but often only as a skeleton on which later centuries hung their own garments. Egypt entered this process with particular force in the modern period, when ancient symbols were increasingly reimagined through esoteric systems. The more Egypt became associated with hidden wisdom, initiation, sacred science, and priestly knowledge, the easier it became to attach the Templars to it. The old order had been in the East. It had been near sacred ruins. It had been secretive. It had been destroyed. That was enough for imagination to begin. It is worth noticing how often these later traditions work backward. They start with the conclusion that the Templars were guardians of an ancient secret, then search the past for images that can support the claim. A falcon becomes Horus. Horus becomes divine kingship. Divine kingship becomes sacred blood. Sacred blood becomes a hidden genealogy. The Templars become its guardians because they are the most dramatic available bridge between antiquity and medieval Europe. This is not careful history, but it is powerful myth-making, and myth-making has its own internal logic. It does not ask, what is the most modest explanation? It asks, what arrangement of symbols produces the deepest sense of hidden continuity? The Templars offer continuity through survival after destruction. Egypt offers continuity through age. The temple offers continuity through sacred architecture. Bloodline offers continuity through bodies. Put them together, and history becomes less a field of broken fragments than a single underground river. That image comforts people, even when it unsettles them. It suggests that the past was not lost, only concealed. That the visible winners of history did not own the whole truth. That defeated orders, ruined temples, and forgotten gods may have carried a second inheritance beneath the official one. In this sense, the Templar occult legend is not only about the Middle Ages, it is about distrust of the surface. The surface says the Templars were founded to protect pilgrims. The legend says that was only the outer mission. The surface says they were destroyed through politics, accusation, and institutional vulnerability. The legend says they were silenced because of what they possessed. The surface says Egypt and the Templars are connected mainly through geography, crusader contact, and later imagination. The legend says Egypt gave them the key. This is where the careful storyteller has to refuse both laziness and ridicule. It would be lazy to accept every occult claim as if symbols alone could prove history. It would also be lazy to dismiss the whole afterlife of the Templars as nonsense. Legends that survive for centuries usually answer a need. They may fail as evidence, but succeed as diagnosis. The Templar myth diagnoses a recurring suspicion that sacred institutions hide their origins, that power depends on concealed ancestry, and that the deepest truths are preserved not by universities or churches, but by endangered brotherhoods. That suspicion has shaped countless stories. In later esoteric systems, the Templars often appear as ancestors of secret brotherhoods or as carriers of teachings that outlived their legal destruction. Sometimes the claimed line is spiritual, sometimes initiatory, sometimes political, sometimes wildly elaborate. The details change, but the emotional structure remains stable. The order falls, but the secret escapes. It is a compelling survival pattern. A body dies, a lineage continues, a temple is destroyed, a symbol remains, a confession is forced, a hidden truth waits for a later age. This pattern made it easy for the so-called bloodline of Horus to enter the larger Templar imagination. Horus already carried themes of inheritance, royal legitimacy, and restored order after violence. The Templars already carried themes of sacred guardianship, downfall, and suspected secrecy. When later writers fused them, they were not simply inventing a random connection. They were joining two symbolic systems that both spoke, in different languages, about rightful authority under threat. But again, symbolic fit is not documentary proof. The strongest evidence points not to a medieval Templar cult of Horus, but to a later reinterpretation of the order through lenses developed long after its dissolution. By then, Egypt had become a vast mirror for European hopes and anxieties about ancient wisdom. The Templars became one of the figures reflected in that mirror. And mirrors are tricky things. They show something real, but not always the thing we think we are seeing. In the mirror of occult legend, the Templars appear as heirs of pharaohs, guardians of sacred blood, initiates beneath Jerusalem, victims of suppression, and carriers of a truth too old for the church to contain. In the rougher mirror of history, They appear as a medieval military order whose secrecy, wealth, sacred location, and violent destruction made them vulnerable to endless reinvention. The distance between those images is the space where our story lives, and perhaps that space is why the Templars never stay dead. They are useful to believers and skeptics alike. To the believer, they offer a hidden chain. To the skeptic, they offer a warning about how chains are forged from fragments. To the historian, they show how memory mutates. To the storyteller, they provide the rarest material of all, a real institution surrounded by unreal certainty. So by the time the Templars reached modern occult legend, they were no longer merely men of the cross. They had become custodians of everything later ages feared had been lost. Egyptian wisdom, temple secrets, royal descent, forbidden initiation, the blood of sacred kings. Not because the medieval evidence securely placed these treasures in their hands, but because their empty hands, after the trials, seemed impossible for imagination to leave empty. Chapter 14. The Horus line reborn in modern myth. By the time the bloodline of Horus enters the Templar story clearly, we are no longer standing in the 12th century. We are standing much closer to ourselves. That matters. Modern legends often dress themselves in ancient clothing. They borrow the names of gods, the shapes of temples, the drama of lost orders, and the authority of old symbols. But their questions are often modern questions. Who controls history? What has been hidden from us? Are official institutions telling the truth? Did power begin where we were told it began? Or is there an older source buried beneath the approved story? The Horus line, as it appears in alternative history and occult speculation, belongs to that world of questions. It is less a medieval doctrine than a modern fusion. Egyptology gave later audiences the names, images, and royal framework. Horus, Isis, Osiris, Pharaoh, divine kingship, sacred inheritance. Templar legend supplied the secret guardians, armed monks, Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, forbidden discovery, persecution, disappearance. Esoteric traditions supplied initiation, hidden wisdom, and the idea that ancient truths pass through selected brotherhoods rather than public institutions. Conspiracy storytelling supplied the final pressure. Someone powerful must have suppressed the truth. The result is a myth that feels ancient, but whose structure is distinctly modern. It is built from recovered fragments and modern suspicion. This does not mean every part of it is foolish. The myth draws from real themes. Ancient Egypt did connect kingship with divine order. Horus was deeply tied to the legitimacy of the ruler. The Templars did operate in the East and became associated with sacred geography. Their trials did generate disturbing records and unanswered questions. Later, secret societies really did adopt older symbols and claim ancient ancestry. But the fusion of those pieces into a literal, continuous bloodline of Horus, guarded by the Templars, is a leap. A very large one. And it is a leap made mostly after the medieval evidence has gone quiet. This is where modern myth becomes so persuasive. It does not usually invent from nothing. It selects. It arranges. It places one true object beside another true object, then draws a line between them that the evidence itself may not support. A real God, a real order, a real sacred site, a real trial, a real fascination with Egypt. These are placed like stones across a dark river. The viewer steps from one to the next, and may not notice where history ends and arrangement begins. The name Horus helps because it carries a powerful emotional charge. He is not merely an obscure figure from an abandoned pantheon. He represents sight from above, the restored heir, the living king, the victory of legitimacy over disorder. In mythic terms, Horus is almost perfectly designed for hidden history storytelling. He gives the legend a royal child, a murdered father, a protective mother, a contested inheritance, and a throne that must be reclaimed. Those are not only religious motifs, they are narrative engines. Attach them to the Templars, and the medieval order becomes more than a brotherhood of crusading knights. They become guardians of the rightful line after catastrophe. Their secrecy becomes loyalty. Their downfall becomes proof of threat. Their silence becomes discipline. Their disappearance becomes survival. It is a clean, powerful story, possibly too clean. Real history tends to leave mud on the floor. Modern myths often sweep it away. They make transmission look purposeful when it may have been accidental. They make symbols look stable when they changed meaning. They make institutions look unified when they were full of human disagreement. They make centuries feel like chapters in a planned book, instead of a chaos of wars, translations, forgetfulness, ambitions, and misreadings. The Horus Templar myth is especially good at creating the illusion of a single design. Egypt becomes the origin. Jerusalem becomes the vault. The Templars become the custodians. The trial becomes the suppression. Modern seekers become the inheritors. Everything has a place. Everything points forward. Nothing is wasted. That is not how historians usually find the past. It is how myth gives the past a spine. There is also another reason the legend feels modern. It distrusts institutions while still craving sacred authority. That may be its deepest contradiction. It rejects the official church, official history, official monarchy, official archives. Yet it does not reject authority itself. Instead, it looks for a purer authority behind the official one, an older bloodline, an older temple, an older god, an older inheritance. It does not want a world without sacred power. It wants sacred power hidden from the people who currently claim to hold it. That is why the bloodline matters so much. Blood gives the myth a form of legitimacy that appears immune to argument. You can debate doctrine. You can challenge institutions. You can reinterpret symbols. But blood, in the imagination, feels stubborn. It seems to belong to the body, to nature, to origin. A hidden bloodline promises that legitimacy can survive even when temples fall and orders are destroyed. Of course, this is also where the myth becomes most risky, because bloodline thinking can slide from symbolism into biological obsession. It can start as a poetic idea about sacred inheritance and end as a fantasy of superior descent. A careful telling must refuse that slide. The value of the Horus line is not that it proves some people are born closer to divinity than others. It does not prove that. It should not be used that way. Its value is interpretive. It shows how people imagine authority surviving across rupture. The pharaoh dies, but Horus continues. The temple falls, but sacred memory remains. The Templar order is dissolved, but the legend says the secret escapes. The old gods are no longer worshipped in the same way, but their symbols keep finding new hosts. That is the rebirth of the Horus line in modern myth, not necessarily in bodies, but in narrative forms. A modern viewer encounters the story and feels, perhaps uneasily, that history has become too shallow in its official version. Kings rise and fall, empires conquer and collapse, institutions make claims, then contradict themselves. Archives are incomplete. The past seems broken. The legend offers repair. It says the breaks are only surface damage. Underneath, the line continued. That promise is enormously attractive. It is also why the story must be treated with discipline. The more a myth satisfies our desire for hidden order, the more likely we are to forgive its weak joints. We stop asking whether the Templars could really have preserved an Egyptian royal tradition. We stop asking where the documents are. We stop asking whether the symbols are being read in their own contexts. We simply enjoy the feeling that everything connects. But connection is not always continuity. Similarity is not always inheritance. Mystery is not always suppression. The Horus line, as modern myth, is best understood as a symbolic fusion of four powerful ingredients: Egypt's divine kingship, the Templars' sacred guardianship, the drama of destroyed orders, and the modern hunger for hidden history. Each ingredient is real in some form. The finished mixture, however, belongs mostly to the imagination of later centuries. And yet imagination has consequences. People act on the stories they believe. They build identities around them. They form societies, write books, make films, accuse enemies, search ruins, reinterpret art, and turn ambiguous symbols into personal revelation. A myth does not need to be factually secure to shape culture. Sometimes uncertainty is what keeps it alive. The bloodline of Horus survives because it gives modern myth a royal pulse. It allows the Templars to become more than victims of political destruction. It allows Egypt to become more than an ancient civilization studied by scholars. It allows the Temple Mount to become more than a contested sacred place. Together, they form a hidden drama of legitimacy, lost, guarded, suppressed, and reborn. As history, the claim remains fragile. As mythology, it is remarkably strong. And perhaps that is the honest position we have to hold. The Horus line was likely not a secret the medieval Templars carried in their saddlebags across the desert. It was reborn much later, in the minds of people trying to make sense of why sacred power feels so ancient, so unstable, and so often concealed behind ruins. The falcon did not need to fly continuously from Egypt to Jerusalem to Europe. It only needed later generations to look up, see its shadow, and decide it had been there all along. Chapter 15. What the desert actually preserved. The desert did not preserve a secret in the way legends want it to. It did not keep a sealed Egyptian doctrine waiting intact for medieval knights. It did not hold a perfect chain of sacred kingship beneath the sand, untouched by conquest, translation, misunderstanding, or time. That version is too clean, too convenient, too eager to turn geography into destiny. What the desert preserved was movement. That may sound less dramatic, but it is more important. Between Egypt, Sinai, and the Levant, people moved for centuries. Soldiers, monks, merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, refugees, guides, prisoners, craftsmen, and scholars. They carried goods, languages, prayers, habits, stories, and misunderstandings. They carried things they meant to carry, and things they did not know they were carrying. A phrase, a ritual gesture, a rumor about a holy place, a fear of an enemy, a memory of a ruin seen once at sunset and never fully understood. Ideas do not always travel as doctrines. Often, they travel as fragments. A trader does not need to explain Egyptian theology to carry an amulet shaped by older symbolism. A monk does not need to preserve pharaonic kingship to inherit a desert tradition of withdrawal, testing, and sacred endurance. A crusader does not need to understand ancient temple religion to feel that the land around him is crowded with vanished powers. A pilgrim does not need to read hieroglyphs to return home convinced that Egypt is older, stranger, and more dangerous to the imagination than the maps suggest. This is what the desert actually preserved: contact zones, places where worlds touched without merging completely. The Eastern Mediterranean was never a set of sealed rooms. Egypt and the Levant had been entangled since antiquity through war, diplomacy, trade, migration, and religion. By the medieval period, those older connections had been layered over by Jewish, Christian, and Islamic histories. Sinai was not merely a stretch of hardship between important places. It was a spiritual landscape in its own right, bound to biblical memory and monastic practice. The Holy Land was not isolated from Egypt. The roots between them mattered politically, economically, and devotionally. For the Templars, this world was not theoretical. Their order operated within the Crusader East, where survival depended on knowing roads, ports, alliances, fortresses, supply lines, and enemy movements. Egypt was not an abstract symbol to Crusader strategy. It was a power, a territory, a prize, a threat, and sometimes the focus of military ambition. The lands between Egypt and Jerusalem were not only mythic corridors. They were real spaces through which campaigns could be planned and lives could be lost. That practical reality matters because it brings the legend back down to earth. If Templars encountered Egyptian influence, it was most likely through the ordinary messiness of the medieval Eastern Mediterranean. Travel, warfare, diplomacy, trade, architecture, rumor, and religious memory, not necessarily through a hidden priesthood handing them the inheritance of Horus. Not through a single initiation that explains everything. Real transmission is usually less theatrical and more durable. It happens because people live near one another, because they borrow, because they imitate, because they misunderstand, because useful practices survive even when their origins are forgotten, because symbols lose one meaning and gain another. This is why the desert is more interesting as a filter than as a vault. A vault preserves objects unchanged. A filter changes what passes through it. The desert stripped stories down. It made them portable. It turned complex histories into memorable images. Pharaoh, Exodus, Sinai, the Holy Family in Egypt, the Desert Fathers, the Holy City, the Temple, the Crusader Road, the Vanished Kingdom. By the time a story crossed from one community to another, it might have lost its original structure, but kept its emotional force. Egypt's ancient past survived in medieval imagination, partly because it had already been absorbed into sacred stories that Christianity knew well. Egypt was the land of bondage, yes, but also the land of refuge. It was the place from which Moses emerged, and the place to which the infant Christ was carried in Christian tradition. It was associated with Pharaoh, wonders, plagues, wisdom, magic, ascetics, and the severe holiness of the desert. Even without accurate knowledge of Horus or pharaonic ritual, medieval Christians inherited an Egypt that was spiritually charged. That charge mattered. It meant that when later writers searched for hidden origins, Egypt was already waiting in the symbolic vocabulary. It did not need to be invented from nothing. It had always been there, looming behind scripture and sanctity, both enemy and refuge, both old kingdom and holy wilderness. The Templars entered that vocabulary because they stood at the crossroads of the same sacred geography. Their order belonged to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem itself was never isolated in religious memory. The road to Jerusalem ran through older stories. Egypt stood near the beginning of many of them. Sinai stood between. The desert became the passage where bondage could become covenant, where exile could become purification, where danger could become revelation. That does not prove a Horus bloodline, but it explains why the legend breathes. A myth does not need every link to be factual if the symbolic terrain feels connected. Egypt, desert, temple, kingship, secrecy, pilgrimage, and sacred violence all belong to the same wide atmosphere of meaning. The Templars were real men moving through that atmosphere. Later imagination turned the air around them into evidence. Here we can say something balanced. It is reasonable to believe that ideas, motifs, and impressions moved between Egypt, the Levant, and Europe during the medieval period. Trade routes allowed goods and stories to circulate. Monastic networks preserved spiritual traditions. Crusader contact zones exposed Europeans to Eastern Christian communities, Islamic learning, local customs, and the physical remains of older civilizations. Even conflict can transmit knowledge, though often in distorted form, but it is not reasonable to turn this general exchange into a precise claim without evidence. A contact zone is not a conspiracy. A route is not a lineage. A resemblance is not a certificate of descent. The desert preserved possibility, not proof. That may feel like a disappointment only if we expected history to behave like a riddle with one hidden answer. But history is often more generous than that. It gives us not one key, but a field of pressures. The Templars were shaped by their mission, their theology, their military role, their privileges, their location, and their enemies. Egypt was shaped in later imagination by antiquity, scripture, mystery, and the slow rediscovery of ancient symbols. The desert lay between them as both road and metaphor. When later mythmakers connected the Templars to Horus, they were not working from nothing. They were working from a landscape where such a connection could feel meaningful, even if it could not be proven. That is the honest heart of this story. The desert preserved echoes, not whole songs. It preserved roots along which a symbol might travel after losing its name. It preserved communities that carried sacred memory through hardship. It preserved the habit of seeing authority, trial, kingship, and revelation as things that happen away from the safety of settled life. It preserved the sense that between Egypt and Jerusalem, the world was not empty, but charged. And perhaps that is why later legends kept returning there. The desert is the perfect place for uncertain inheritance, too open to be controlled, too harsh to be sentimental, too ancient to feel ordinary. It gives the imagination space to connect what the archive leaves apart. What it actually preserved was not the blood of Horus in the veins of hidden heirs. It preserved the conditions under which people could believe such a bloodline might have passed unnoticed from one sacred world into another. Chapter 16. The bloodline that was not blood. At a certain point, every hidden bloodline story must face a simple problem. Bodies do not pass through history as cleanly as symbols do. families break, names change, records burn, dynasties collapse. Children are born outside approved lines. Marriages are arranged for reasons no mythmaker would find poetic. Conquerors rewrite genealogies. Priests bless one claimant and condemn another. Scribes make mistakes. Forgers improve the past. Time does not protect bloodlines. It erodes them, complicates them, and sometimes turns them into stories told by people who need the story more than the proof. This is why the most plausible Templar connection to the line of Horus is not biological. It is ideological. The bloodline was not blood. It was a way of imagining sacred authority moving through the world. That may sound like a retreat from mystery, but it actually brings us closer to the heart of it. A literal secret lineage from Horus to the Templars asks us to believe in a chain for which the evidence is not strong enough. But an ideological lineage asks a subtler question. Can ideas of divine kingship, temple guardianship, hidden legitimacy, and sacred inheritance pass from one culture to another, not as a formal doctrine, but as a recurring pattern? The answer is yes. Not always directly, not always consciously, not always honestly, but yes. Sacred authority has a remarkable ability to change costumes. In Egypt, it could appear as the living Horus, the ruler who embodied order against chaos. In biblical kingship, it could appear through covenant, anointing, and chosen lineage. In medieval Christendom, it could appear through coronation, relics, crusading vows, and the defense of holy places. In later esoteric traditions, it could appear as initiation, secret descent, hidden masters, or a wisdom older than public religion. These are not the same system, but they rhyme, and that rhyme is what later legend mistakes for inheritance. The Templars stood at a point where many of these themes converged. They were guardians, but not kings, monks, but armed, poor by vow, but rich in institution, publicly devoted, but internally private, bound to Jerusalem, yet active across Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. They lived in the shadow of the temple, a place where sacred architecture and sacred kingship could hardly be separated in the imagination. So when later centuries searched for carriers of a hidden royal tradition, the Templars seemed almost pre-selected. They did not need to have actual Horus blood. They had symbolic qualifications. They had the temple. They had secrecy. They had a spectacular fall. They had enemies powerful enough to make suppression believable. They had silence afterward. And silence is where symbolic inheritance often does its best work. The phrase bloodline of Horus therefore becomes less misleading if we hear it as metaphor. It points toward the survival of an ancient idea, that legitimate power descends from a sacred source and must be guarded from corruption, usurpation, or forgetfulness. Horus is the image of restored kingship. The Templar is the image of the armed guardian. The temple is the image of divine order housed in stone. The desert is the passage between worlds. Together they form a language, not a genealogy. This matters because the symbolic reading explains why the legend survived without requiring us to distort the evidence. The Templars did not need to possess Egyptian scrolls proving a pharaonic line. They did not need to practice rites of Horus beneath Jerusalem. They did not need to smuggle royal descendants through crusader territories. Those claims may belong to fiction unless stronger evidence appears. What they did possess was a historical position that later imagination could charge with meaning. They were a real order in a real sacred landscape, destroyed under real accusations, leaving behind real uncertainty. That was enough. Legends are often built where facts are dramatic but incomplete. The Templars give us exactly that. Their practical mission can be documented. Their rise can be explained. Their wealth can be traced. Their fall can be studied. But around the edges, there are gaps, private ceremonies, coerced confessions, lost records, destroyed reputations, rumors that cannot be fully tested. Those gaps became doorways. Through them entered Horus, or rather, through them entered the idea of Horus as later imagination understood him. Ancient kingship, divine inheritance, royal legitimacy older than Christianity. The falcon did not arrive with a passport from the Nile. It arrived as a symbol that seemed to complete the pattern, and the pattern was powerful. A sacred king is murdered or displaced. The rightful line is hidden. Guardians preserve it. Authorities persecute them. The truth survives underground. One day, someone follows the signs. This pattern appears in many forms because it answers a deep human discomfort. We know that history is often unjust. We know that rightful people are defeated and unworthy people crowned. We know archives are incomplete and official stories are shaped by winners. A hidden bloodline becomes a moral correction to history. It promises that legitimacy did not die merely because power destroyed its visible defenders. But history cannot be repaired by wishing. A responsible investigation has to separate emotional truth from factual claim. The emotional truth is that people long for a sacred order beneath political chaos. The factual claim that the Templars preserved a literal bloodline of Horus remains unsupported. Between those two statements lies the more interesting possibility. The Templar Horus legend is a myth about authority trying to survive the collapse of institutions. That is why blood was such a useful metaphor. Blood is hidden inside the body, but it proves life. It moves unseen, but everything depends on it. It connects generations. It stains when violence occurs. It can be spilled, inherited, purified, corrupted, blessed, or cursed. No wonder sacred traditions return to it. Blood is the perfect symbol for invisible continuity. But the continuity in this story is not in veins. It is in meanings. The Templars became part of a long symbolic chain because they seemed to guard the place where divine authority had once touched earth. Egypt entered because it represented the older grammar of sacred kingship. Horus entered because he embodied the living principle of rightful rule. The bloodline entered because modern imagination needed continuity to feel physical, not merely abstract. This is how ideology becomes mistaken for ancestry. And yet, ideology can be more durable than ancestry. A family line can vanish. A symbol can sleep for centuries and return under another name. A king's body can decay. Kingship, as a sacred idea, can be revived whenever people need power to appear chosen. The temple can be destroyed. The idea of the temple can continue to organize longing. An order can be dissolved. The image of guardianship can survive in myth. So the mystery resolves, but not by closing. The Templars probably did not carry the blood of Horus. They carried, or rather later generations made them carry, the question Horus represents. What makes authority sacred? Is it birth? Is it ritual? Is it divine favor? Is it the defense of holy places? Is it the willingness of others to believe? That question passed through Egypt, Jerusalem, Medieval monarchy, Crusader ideology, and modern occult speculation. It changed at every stage. It was never one pure doctrine. It was a recurring hunger for legitimacy that could outlive every system built to contain it. In the end, the hidden lineage was not a family. It was a story about power wanting an ancient source, and the Templars, standing beneath the cross with the temple behind them and the desert before them, became one of the most convincing masks that story ever wore. Chapter 17. The Last Heirs of a Sacred Illusion. In the end, the legend survives because it gives shape to a feeling almost everyone has had at least once. That history is hiding something. Not a small thing, not a misplaced date or a forgotten name. Something older, something beneath the official surface. A buried inheritance that would explain why power has always seemed to gather around temples, crowns, blood, oaths, and silence. The story of the Templars and the bloodline of Horus belongs to that desire. As history, it must be handled with restraint. The medieval evidence does not securely show that the Templars discovered or preserved a literal Egyptian royal lineage. The connection to Horus grows most clearly in later imagination, where Egypt becomes the ancient source, Jerusalem becomes the sacred vault, and the Templars become guardians of a truth too dangerous to leave exposed. But as myth, the story is revealing. It tells us that people do not want power to be accidental. They want it to come from somewhere. A god, a king, a temple, a bloodline, a covenant, a hidden order that knows what the rest of us have forgotten. That desire is not difficult to understand. Ordinary history can feel brutally unfinished. Good causes fail. Sacred places are conquered. Orders rise with vows of purity and fall into politics, debt, fear, and betrayal. Archives leave gaps. Confessions cannot always be trusted. Ruins keep their faces turned away. So legend steps in and offers a different arrangement. Nothing was lost, it says, only hidden. The king did not die. The line continued. The temple was not empty. The guardians escaped. The old god still casts a shadow. This is why the desert remains the right place to leave the story. Not because it proves the legend, but because it understands it. The desert is where certainty thins. It is where maps become suggestions, where footsteps vanish, where distance turns memory into symbol. Between Egypt and Jerusalem, between Horus and the cross, between sacred kingship and military brotherhood, the imagination finds room to work. The last heirs of this story are not secret descendants moving unseen through royal houses. They are us, the viewers, the readers, the seekers who keep returning to the possibility that behind the broken record of history there might be a hidden design. We inherit not the blood of Horus, but the question carried by the myth. Why do human beings need authority to feel ancient before they will believe in it? Perhaps because power without origin feels naked. Perhaps because ruins make us suspicious. Perhaps because every age fears that the truth was buried just before we arrived. The Templars became perfect vessels for that fear. They were real enough to anchor the story, secretive enough to invite suspicion, powerful enough to attract enemies, and destroyed dramatically enough to leave behind a wound that never fully closed. Egypt gave that wound depth. Horus gave it royal shape. Blood gave it urgency. But the bloodline was never the most important part. The illusion was A sacred illusion, yes, but not a worthless one. It reveals how strongly we long for continuity in a world of collapse. It shows how symbols can outlive the civilizations that first gave them meaning. It reminds us that legends often survive not because they are true, but because they express something facts alone cannot satisfy. So the map that should not exist remains, not as evidence of a hidden pharaonic dynasty guarded by medieval knights, as a map of human longing, a cross in the desert, a falcon in the mind, a temple beneath memory, and somewhere under sand, stone, and silence, not the old gods themselves, perhaps, but the need for them, still waiting, still watching, still casting its shadow across the stories we choose to believe.